Alan Mayer here once again with day 105 of our 365 Bible studies. We are still looking at the early monarchy, the period between Saul and Solomon, and we are now looking at the visit of the Queen of Sheba to the court of Solomon. This is the first book of Kings, chapter 10, verses 1 to 13. The Queen of Sheba heard how famous Solomon was, and decided to go to Jerusalem to try him out with some difficult problems. She came, accompanied by a large entourage and a caravan of camels laden with spice, jewels, and plenty of gold. She met Solomon and asked him everything she could think of. He was able to answer all her queries. There wasn't anything too difficult for him. She was astonished and amazed by his wisdom, by the palace he'd built, the food served at his table, his officials' living quarters, the way his staff were organized, and the uniforms they wore, his servants who served him at his feasts, and the magnificence of his processions to the temple. She said to him, "Everything I heard back home about your deeds and your wisdom is true. I didn't believe it, but now I've come and I've seen it for myself. What I had heard wasn't even half of it. Your wisdom and prosperity exceed all that I was told. Your wives are blessed, your servants who are by you all the time are privileged to hear all the wise things you say. Thanks to Yahweh your God, who has shown you how pleased he is with you by making you Israel's king. His love for Israel will go on forever, and he's made you their king to keep giving them law and justice." She gave King Solomon the gifts she had brought, more than 4,000 kilograms of gold and a large amount of spice and jewels, more spice than anyone else had ever given him. In return, he gave her everything she asked for, in addition to a generous number of the expected gifts he had already given. Then she returned to Sheba with her entourage. At this distance in time, it's hard for us to place Sheba on a map. Pliny, writing centuries later, places it in Arabia. It is unlikely that this trip was made purely to satisfy the Queen's curiosity about the size of Solomon's intellect, however, and it is the value of the gifts exchange that itself speaks volumes about the benefits to mutual trade and commerce that would have benefited both sides. Her entourage would have been working with Solomon's officials on the details, whilst the monarchs were enjoying themselves in intellectual and possibly spiritual pursuits. This is Solomon at his most impressive. His intellectual and economic skills, his success in foreign trade, and the splendor of his court are described in the remaining verses of chapter 10. When we come later in the series to look at the wisdom literature in the Bible, we shall see what kind of things made for wisdom in those days. The later editors of Solomon's story were not at all keen on Jews entertaining foreign adventures, however, since they thought that the Babylon experience, and indeed much of their nation's history, had taught them to separate and to be separate and distinct from other nations. So it is surprising that they left so much detail about Solomon's success and the praise from Sheba's queen intact in their final draft. They saved their criticism of Solomon for the next chapter, see tomorrow, where they blamed him and his tolerance for the forthcoming schism of the nation, whose approach had already been showing back in the last days of King David, as we saw back on day 102. My feeling is that Solomon's reign had been a great success. His tolerance of foreigners and his indulgence of the spiritual practices of his foreign wives had been a splendid move, far in advance of his time. There is even evidence of Egyptian influence in some of his wisdom writings. The Egyptian instruction of Amen Emopet is closely echoed in Proverbs chapters 22 to 24. It is no surprise that this intellectual and liberal leader was not understood by his contemporaries or the later editors of his story. He was a shining morning star. But the dawn of true enlightenment was still a long way away. Tomorrow we look briefly at what Solomon's later critics thought of him. See you tomorrow.